This was the scene in Haiti after an earthquake leveled the city of Port-au-Prince in 2010. More than 250,000 people died. Countless others were injured or made homeless. Bodies went uncollected on the streets in one of the poorest countries on earth. Aid organizations from around the world poured in to help, including the United Nations, which already had a long-standing presence in the country. Allegations of rape and sexual abuse quickly surfaced against UN personnel.
Any Haitian can tell you about UN peacekeeper sexual exploitation of Haitian women and children with almost no consequences. Peacekeepers were abusing women and girls and traded food or cash for sexual favors.
These allegations are not exclusive to Haiti. From the Central African Republic to Bosnia, United Nations staff and peacekeeping soldiers have been accused of horrific acts of sexual exploitation on a mass scale, and almost no one is ever held accountable.
They see a peacekeeper coming their way, they think, this is someone who's going to help me. They don't think, I gotta run, this is somebody who's going to rape me.
How did we get to a place where the people being sent to save lives and rebuild societies are committing the exact brutal acts that they are there to prevent?
Est-ce que vous parlez d'île qui est pas parlé?
M'a dit son ministre, mais il va prendre ici, il va penser c'est vrai.
When the UN goes into conflict zones and disaster areas, its staff operate with a different but similar legal immunity to international diplomats. This is meant to protect them from pressure or threats of prosecution by local actors. But it leads to an incredibly complex process when trying to hold UN personnel to account for wrongdoing.
For 75 years, the United Nations has had something called the Convention on Privileges and Immunities. And what that says is when the UN personnel are accused of doing something even as egregious as gang raping the people they're supposed to be protecting, certainly before any trial can occur, the UN itself has to give permission to that country to proceed with normal legal processes.
Nearly 1,800 sexual abuse cases have been reported against UN staff and peacekeepers over the last 2 decades. Yet only 67 Blue Helmets have officially been jailed, and according to a PBS report, only one international civilian has ever been sentenced to prison as of 2018, with at least one other individual having been tried and convicted for the rape of several women. Didier Bourget was sentenced to 9 years by a French judge in 2009. By 2018, he was out and gave an interview to Frontline about the ease with which UN staff can commit abuse.
How many children did you have sex with in Congo?
I would say about 20, 25. I didn't count, but that's about that.
One basic problem is that few rich countries contribute soldiers to UN forces. Nowadays, they prefer sending money and leave the peacekeeping to troops from developing nations, some of whose militaries are actually under investigation for human rights abuses themselves, although Western troops have also faced sexual abuse allegations while on peacekeeping missions.
So an annual contract from the United Nations to Burundi to provide peacekeepers sustains this government's military. Burundi, which is a rogue country that has been accused of all kinds of human rights abuses at home, sends those same soldiers then to the Central African Republic as peacekeepers and expects them to behave. They end up raping and sexually exploiting the local population, and the government of Burundi does nothing. It doesn't conduct investigations. It doesn't do its job.
This has become a way for developing nations to help sustain their armed forces. And because UN peacekeeping troops are only ever subject to the courts-martial of their home countries, crimes committed by these soldiers are almost never adequately investigated, let alone punished.
We have set a 6 months time frame. If the allegations are extremely egregious, then a 3 months time frame has been put into place. But again, we don't hold all the cards, right? So if a soldier from country X is alleged to have committed a crime, we, as our own UN investigators, don't always have access to that person because that military may not want to give us that access.
It's not just a case of the bad apple, it's actually a systemic issue. The systemic conditions of the environments into which peacekeepers are deployed, the power dynamics between the United Nations and humanitarian organisations and the people they've been deployed to protect and serve.
But if anything, the issue of sexual abuse seems to be even more widespread amongst the civilian personnel who work for the UN. In 2020, there were 165 allegations of exploitation and sexual abuse, 117 of which were committed by civilians.
The overwhelming majority of UN personnel who commit what they call sexual exploitation and abuse in countries around the world are not soldiers and they're not police. They are civilian personnel of the UN who are far more protected from any kind of police investigation or court proceeding than any soldier is.
In 2017, Prashanti Tiwari was formerly employed by BVHA, an organization contracted by a branch of the UN in India. In an allegation resembling those made against Harvey Weinstein, she reported having been groped and offered career advancement in exchange for sexual favors by a high-ranking UN official.
He openly offered me a permanent contract to work with the UN if I gave in to his sexual demands. In the elevator, he broke my breast. Even today, it brings tremors to my entire body. As soon as I launched this campaign with the Bihar police here in India, the entire UN system, I would call it, came down crashingly on me with all its might to trivialize my entire allegation. They were doing it to portray it as an employment issue so that they could protect the perpetrator.
Sadly, the scourge of abuse of women and girls and even boys and men is a global one. And the UN is no different. It goes against everything we stand for. The very small number of people who've been engaging in this abhorrent behavior tarnish the amazing work that the hundreds of thousands of UN people do around the world.
The abuse reported can vary between outright violent rape and so-called transactional sexual exploitation.
Transactional sex seems to be the most prevalent type of abuse and exploitation perpetrated. It's cases where there is some negotiation between victim, survivor, and perpetrator, where there's agency and consent.
The power imbalance between aid workers and the desperately vulnerable people they are sent to help creates the potential for the most brutal forms of exploitation.
They're actually doing a whole range of non-security work, like running refugee camps, supporting distribution of food and humanitarian resources, a particularly difficult and unregulated environment which creates opportunities for people to abuse and exploit.
Often, this involves UN staff trading the very humanitarian supplies they have been sent to deliver for sexual favors.
In the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, a young girl, Faela, 13-year-old, had been raped by soldiers during the war and as a result fell pregnant and was thrown out of her family and walked to the refugee camp. When she got there, she was alone. She gave birth to a son. She had no way to support herself at all. And so every night she climbed through the fence of the United Nations peacekeepers base and she exchanged sex for a banana, a biscuit, sometimes $1. And what she told the journalists was, what other option was there for me? Who else would have looked after my son if that wasn't what I did?
Kathy Bolkovac is a former police officer who joined a UN peacekeeping mission to post-war Bosnia in 1999. She exposed a trafficking ring in which UN personnel were transporting women and underage girls for sexual exploitation.
They eventually saw a door at the top of the stairs. We broke it in and found 7 young women. And at that time, I really connected and made the connection that something very drastic and horrible was going on in Bosnia.
However, when she brought this information to the UN contractor she was working for, they fired her. No one was prosecuted, but some of the UN contractors were forced to resign and leave the country. The story was eventually made into a Hollywood film.
I know what's been happening to you.
You promise you can stop these men?
I promise.
So despite 2 decades, Hollywood attention, and repeated promises from successive secretaries general, why hasn't this problem been fixed?
I pledge to work closely with member states on structural, legal, and operational measures to make zero tolerance a reality.
We are not going to tolerate that. We're going to do everything we can to prevent this from happening. Organizations often are afraid to be transparent and to be open because they know that they will then come under scrutiny from the outside. It's not really about how others view them. It's about, are they safeguarding beneficiaries from being abused and exploited by members of their organization?
All too often, it seems the internal procedures put in place to protect victims and investigate crimes are more designed to protect the UN's reputation than expose wrongdoing and punish perpetrators. And when whistleblowers do come forward, instead of being listened to and protected, they can themselves be victimized and silenced. This is what happened to Caroline Hunt Mathis, a former UN investigator who raised concerns over a rape allegation of a Sri Lankan refugee against a UN aid worker and was fired for it.
I was in litigation for 15 years in regards to this issue. And I, in fact, won my case after 10 years and was happy to walk away. It became actually the longest litigation in UN history.
There seems to be a perceived fear that exposing cases of abuse will damage the UN's reputation and thus endanger the essential work that it does.
I think one of the risks when we're talking about this is that it can seem like we should just throw away peacekeeping and humanitarian work because these abuses are perpetrated. We need to use them as an opportunity to make the system stronger so that that important work is done, because we can't just leave some of the world's most conflict-affected and vulnerable populations to fend for themselves.
The organisation is a security apparatus designed to maintain the power of those that won the war. And it simply did not think about the consequences of peacekeeping.
The UN is a vital force for good in the world. It is the perception of cover-ups and systemic exploitation, which, to be fair, is often justified, that is doing the actual reputational damage.
I think that the world cannot live without it. It does indispensable and enormously important work around the world, just as Hollywood puts out great films, despite the fact that it has a legacy of sexually abusing and exploiting its mostly female actors. The UN has to practice what it preaches, and it will never achieve its goals, whether it's world peace or the end of discrimination against women. It has to fix itself internally and move into the 21st century.
And there are some indications that the UN may be taking steps towards reform. In 2017, Jane Connors became the first dedicated victims' rights advocate within the organization.
You see women who've been exploited or abused by personnel from the organization you work for. You feel very, very upset. You try to think of what can be done. The Secretary General finds this behavior repugnant. I can do very little. We need to do much more, and really to shift the balance towards the rights and dignity of victims, bearing in mind that there will be, the reputation of the organization is often uppermost in people's minds.
We ensure that the soldiers that come have been vetted, which include human rights violations, sexual abuse, sexual exploitation. We now publish in real time every allegation of sexual abuse. It is a constant work, constant focus on the victims, constant focus on vetting, and constant focus on training.
But there are still desperately few examples of perpetrators actually being prosecuted, and only time will tell if this new initiative is yet more reputation-shielding tokenism or a real-deal attempt at righting some of the horrific harms that have been committed.